At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, a security guard at Seattle's waterfront watched a woman in a gray dress walk through a locked door. She didn't open it. She walked through it. He checked the cameras. Nothing. He checked again. Still nothing. But he saw her. He knows what he saw. Welcome to Verified Fears. Welcome to Verified Fears. Anaya had been counting passengers for 8 years, and the numbers always matched. That was the foundation of ferry terminal operations. Every person who boarded had to be accounted for. Every manifest had to reconcile with the physical head count, and every departure had to follow protocol. At 34, Anaya had overseen more than 4,000 sailings from her position as operations manager at one of the busiest passenger terminals on the waterfront. She understood the rhythm of the graveyard shift, the way fog rolled in during October and November, the patterns of late-night travelers catching the 2:15 a.m. departure. She knew how to handle technical glitches, how to calm anxious passengers, and how to coordinate with captains during weather delays. What she didn't know was how to explain October 12th, when the numbers stopped making sense in ways that defied every logical explanation she'd built her career upon. The 2:15 a.m. sailing was routine until Anaya reviewed the boarding count at her terminal workstation. 28 passengers had scanned tickets at the gate. The digital turnstile registered 28 entries. The security checkpoint logged 28 individuals passing through. But when the departure manifest populated on her screen 3 minutes before sailing, it showed 101 passengers aboard the vessel. Anaya stared at the discrepancy, assuming a system error. The passenger tracking software had glitched before, usually displaying duplicate entries or failing to clear previous sailings from the database. She radioed the gate attendant, Fiona, asking her to verify the physical count. Fiona confirmed 28 people had boarded, no exceptions, no walk-ons that bypassed scanning. Anaya made a note to file a technical report in the morning and cleared the vessel for departure. Watching through the operations center windows as the ferry pulled away from the dock, its lights disappearing into the thick November fog that had settled over the water like a blanket. 10 minutes after departure, the radio crackled with the captain's voice. Trinity, who had been running this route for 12 years, sounded slightly amused when she reported a full house, mentioning that the passenger deck was more crowded than usual for a weeknight sailing. Anaya felt confusion tighten in her chest. She asked Trinity to estimate the passenger count visually. After a pause, Trinity responded that she'd guess around 90 to 100 people, maybe more, which was unusual for the late sailing but not unprecedented during holiday weekends. Except this wasn't a holiday weekend. This was a Tuesday in October, and Anaya had watched 28 people board. She pulled up the security camera footage, rewinding to the boarding period between 1:45 a.m. and 2:12 a.m. The timestamp showed every passenger who had walked through the gate. Anaya counted manually, pausing and replaying sections to ensure accuracy. 28 individuals. No more. She could see their faces, their luggage, the way they handed tickets to Fiona and moved through the covered walkway to the vessel. The cameras positioned at the boarding ramp showed the same 28 people stepping onto the ferry. No one else. The footage was clear, well-lit and unambiguous. Yet Trinity was sailing with a crowded passenger deck, and the manifest showed 101 souls aboard. Anaya stood and walked to the terminal's western windows, which overlooked the boarding dock and the waterfront beyond. The fog was dense, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. But she could see the wet concrete of the passenger waiting area glistening under the sodium lights. That's when she noticed the footprints. Dozens of them. wet impressions leading from the waiting area benches toward the boarding gate, as though a large group had recently walked through water before entering the terminal. But it hadn't rained. The concrete should be dry, and those footprints led to the gate where only 28 people had passed. She returned to her workstation and opened the archived manifest system, searching for historical sailing data. The 2:15 a.m. departure ran 7 nights per week, year-round, serving late-shift workers, insomniacs, and the occasional tourist. Anaya filtered the records by passenger manifest discrepancies, looking for similar errors. What she found made her hands go cold. The same 73 names appeared on manifests dating back decades. Different dates, different years, but always the 2:15 a.m. sailing, always 73 additional passengers beyond the verified boarding count. Names like Aubrey, Michelle, Matilda, Liliana, Mallory, Mariah, Helena, Winter, Carmen, Alaya, Liana, Holly, Madeline, Phoenix, Raylan, Willa, Helen, Emily, Alessandra, Gracelyn, Carolina, Arlith, Salem, Dorothy, Xiomara, Elisa, Rain, Florence, Alicia, Madeline, Melanie, Catalina, Zariah, Bonnie, McKenna, Imani, Armani, Edith, Nalani, May, Vienna, Hadassah, Stephanie, Ari, Kate, Jimena, Brianna, Faye, Jordan, Louise, Amber, Michaela, Zara, Lila, Margot, Amura, Jennifer, Kyla, Mila, Winnie, Allison, Amalia, Raina, Aviana, Ali, Ivana, Araya, Lillian, Aaliyah, Ilani, Noah, Raina, Lexi, and Brinley. 73 names, repeated across years, always on the 2:15 a.m. manifest, never with corresponding ticket purchases or boarding scans. Anaya's breath caught when she expanded the search parameters to include historical maritime records. A newspaper archive from 1952 contained a front-page story about a ferry disaster. A vessel that had departed at 2:15 a.m. on October 12th, struck submerged debris in heavy fog, and sank within minutes. 73 casualties, all passengers. The list of the deceased matched the names appearing on the manifests. Every single one. She looked up from her screen toward the windows. The fog had grown thicker, almost oppressive, pressing against the glass like something alive. Through the murk, Anaya could see the 2:15 a.m. ferry making its crossing, its lights distant pinpoints in the darkness. She grabbed the binoculars from the equipment cabinet and focused on the vessel, adjusting for the fog and distance. The passenger deck came into hazy focus. Figures stood along the railing, far more than 28. They were dressed strangely in clothing that looked decades out of date, coats and hats that belonged to another era. Anaya adjusted the focus, trying to see more clearly. One figure, a woman in a gray dress, stood at the railing facing back toward the terminal. Even at 200 yards through heavy fog, Anaya felt the woman's gaze lock onto her with impossible precision. The woman didn't move, didn't wave, just stared with an intensity that transcended distance and weather and the rational boundaries of human vision. Anaya lowered the binoculars, her hands shaking. She called Trinity on the radio, asking about the passengers one more time. Trinity responded cheerfully that everyone was settled in for the crossing. No issues. Normal night. Anaya asked specifically about passengers in vintage clothing, people wearing styles from the 1950s. Trinity laughed and said everyone looked pretty modern to her, mostly people in work clothes and casual wear, nothing unusual. The disconnect between what Trinity experienced and what Anaya saw was absolute. The ferry completed its crossing and docked at the destination terminal. Trinity radioed the all clear, reporting that 96 passengers had disembarked, close to the manifest count, accounting for normal variation in her estimate. The destination terminal's operations manager, Someone Anaya had worked with for years logged 28 arrivals. 28 people got off the ferry, the same 28 who had boarded. But Trinity had sailed with a full deck. The manifest had shown 101. And Anaya had seen the figures standing at the railing, wearing clothes from 70 years ago, staring back at the terminal with expressions she couldn't decipher from that distance, but felt in her bones. Determination, confusion, perhaps the simple desire to reach a destination they'd been trying to get to since 1952. Anaya spent the rest of her shift reading about the 1952 disaster. The ferry had been overcrowded that night, operating beyond capacity, rushing to maintain schedule despite dangerous fog conditions. When it struck the debris and began taking on water, there hadn't been enough lifeboats. 73 people went down with the vessel. Their bodies were never recovered. The wreck settled in deep water and was never salvaged. The route continued operating after a brief suspension, using different vessels, maintaining the same schedule because the late-night crossing served essential workers who had no other option. And apparently, 73 passengers who never reached their destination kept trying, night after night, decade after decade, boarding a ferry that would never sink again, but could never deliver them to the place they'd been traveling toward when everything went wrong. The 2:15 a.m. sailing still runs that route. Anaya still manages the overnight shift. The passenger count still doesn't match. 28 board, 101 sail, 28 arrive. She stopped filing technical reports because the question isn't whether they're there. Trinity sees them. The manifest logs them. The vessel carries them across water that claimed them 70 years ago. The question is why they keep trying to complete a journey that ended in darkness and cold water, and whether any destination is worth the eternal attempt to reach it. Anaya watches them every night now. Those 73 names that repeat in the system, those figures at the railing dressed in clothes from another time. She stopped trying to explain it to her supervisors, stopped questioning the mathematics that don't add up, stopped fighting the reality that her job has become bearing witness to tragedy replaying itself in an endless loop. Some nights she thinks she should request a transfer to the day shift. But someone has to count the passengers who board in fog and sail toward places they'll never reach. Someone has to know their names. And on October 12th every year, Anaya makes sure to say those 73 names aloud before the 2:15 a.m. departure. Because being remembered might be the only destination that matters when you're lost between the dock and the shore, between the living and the dead, between boarding and arriving in a crossing that never ends. Ela had been cleaning operating rooms for 15 years, and she knew what sterile meant. At 41, she understood hospital protocols better than most of the administrators who wrote them. Room 7 in the surgical wing was supposed to be locked after the final procedure ended at 6 in the evening. The environmental services schedule had her arriving at midnight to perform routine maintenance cleaning on rooms that had been empty for hours. Locked rooms stayed clean. That was the basic logic of hospital operations. But for 3 months straight, every single night when Ela unlocked operating room 7 at 12:15, she found it dirty. Not just dusty or in need of routine maintenance, actually dirty, with fresh blood on the floor, surgical instruments out of place on the equipment trays, and overhead lights set to the dim setting used during active procedures. The first night she'd reported it immediately, assuming someone had violated the lockdown protocol and performed an unauthorized surgery. Her supervisor, Mavis, had come down personally to investigate and found the room completely pristine. The security cameras showed the room had remained locked and empty since 6 p.m. But Ela had just cleaned blood off that floor. She had physical evidence on her cleaning cloths, except when Mavis examined them, they were clean. The pattern continued nightly. Isla would unlock room 7, find evidence of recent surgical activity, clean it thoroughly, lock it, and move on to the next room. She set up her personal phone to record one night, propping it on the instrument cart to capture the entire cleaning process. When she reviewed the footage later, it showed her entering a clean room, going through the motions of cleaning an already spotless floor, and leaving. But her memory was absolute. She had scrubbed blood from the tile. She had reorganized instruments that were scattered. She had wiped down surfaces that were marked with handprints. The disconnect between what she experienced and what cameras recorded made her question her own sanity until she found the surgical cap on the floor during her 4th week of this routine. It was tucked partially under the operating table, easy to miss, made of the disposable material used during procedures. Someone had written a name on the inside band in permanent marker. Lena. Hospital records going back decades were accessible through the staff database if you knew where to look. Isla spent her lunch break in the administrative office, scrolling through archived personnel files. Lena had been a surgeon at the hospital, specializing in cardiac procedures, working primarily in operating room 7. She had died in 1987 during a surgery that had gone catastrophically wrong. The patient, a woman named Cecilia, had been undergoing what should have been a routine valve replacement. But complications had cascaded: unexpected bleeding, equipment malfunction, errors in judgment compounded by stress and fatigue. Both Lena and Cecilia had died in that room. The official report listed the time of death as 11:53 p.m. for the surgeon, who had suffered a massive heart attack while trying to save her patient. Cecilia had died at 11:47 p.m. The surgery had started at 10:30 p.m. The entire disaster had unfolded over 83 minutes. Isla started arriving early, at 11:45 p.m. instead of midnight, parking herself outside operating room 7 with her cleaning cart and a thermos of coffee. The first night she tried this, she heard nothing unusual. The second night, at exactly 11:46 p.m., she heard sounds from inside the locked room. The rhythmic beeping of patient monitors, urgent voices speaking in medical terminology, the metallic clink of surgical instruments. Isla pressed her ear against the door. She could hear Lena's voice, sharp with stress, calling out instructions. She could hear other staff members responding, their words clipped and professional despite obvious panic. She could hear the accelerating alarm of a heart monitor, the desperate tone that signaled a patient crashing. At 11:53 p.m., she heard a different alarm, and someone shouting for help, and then at midnight exactly, absolute silence. The sounds didn't fade. They cut off as though someone had flipped a switch. Isla unlocked the door with shaking hands. The room was a mess. Blood on the floor, instruments scattered, equipment moved from standard positions, lights on dim. She cleaned it as she always did, working mechanically through her shock. When she finished and locked the room behind her, she finally understood what was happening. Operating room 7 wasn't being used by unauthorized personnel. It was being used by people who had never stopped using it, who were trapped in the final surgery they'd ever perform, replaying those 83 minutes every single night. Lena was trying to save Cecilia. She would always be trying to save Cecilia. And the room would always need cleaning afterward because something about that disaster had marked the physical space, creating a loop that played out whether anyone was there to witness it or not. Isla researched the specific surgery, reading medical journals and archived case studies about what had gone wrong. The errors were documented, analyzed by professionals who used Lena and Cecilia's deaths as teaching examples for how to prevent similar cascading failures. But no amount of analysis could change what had happened. Lena had made a choice under pressure that had accelerated the patient's decline. She had realized her mistake too late. The stress had triggered her own cardiac event. 2 lives had ended in that room. One because of medical complications, and one because of the unbearable weight of failing to save someone you were responsible for protecting. The next night, Ela arrived at 11:30 p.m. and sat outside room 7, listening to the surgery replay through the door. She heard every moment of it now. The initial confidence in Lena's voice, the first sign of trouble at 11:37 p.m., the escalating crisis, the desperate attempts to stabilize Cecilia. The moment at 11:47 p.m. when the patient's heart stopped and couldn't be restarted. And finally, the chaos at 11:53 p.m. when Lena collapsed. When midnight arrived and silence fell, Ela unlocked the door and began cleaning. She worked carefully, respectfully, treating the space the way you would treat any place where people had died, trying their best and failing anyway. She cleaned room 7 every night for the next 2 months, listening to the surgery replay, bearing witness to Lena's eternal attempt to correct her mistakes and save the patient who was always already dying. Operating room 7 is still on Ila's cleaning rotation. She still unlocks it at midnight and finds it dirty. She still hears the surgery replaying in the minutes before she enters. Other staff members have started to notice that she spends extra time on that particular room, that she's protective of it in ways that seem unusual. Mavis asked her once if everything was okay, if the room bothered her, if she wanted it removed from her assignment. Ela declined, because someone has to clean up after the surgery that never ends. Someone has to witness Lena trying to get it right, night after night, surgery after surgery, forever attempting to save the patient she lost in 1987. The room will always be dirty at midnight. Lena will always be trying. And Ela will always be there to clean up afterward, because that's what you do for people who are trapped in their worst moments, replaying their failures eternally. You bear witness, you honor their effort, and you make sure that when they try again tomorrow night, the room is ready for them. Eve had been working the graveyard shift at the coffee shop for 4 years, and she knew every regular by their drink order. At 27, she had memorized the rhythms of the overnight hours, the students cramming for exams who arrived around midnight, the hospital workers on break at 2 a.m., the insomniacs who wandered in at random intervals seeking caffeine and human contact. The shop was an independent place near the University District, one of the few genuinely 24-hour establishments left in a city where most businesses had reduced their hours. Eve appreciated the solitude of the night shift, the way time moved differently between midnight and dawn, the intimate conversations she had with regulars who treated the shop like a confessional booth where they could admit things they'd never say in daylight. She thought she understood her customers, thought she could read people after thousands of late-night interactions. Then Eve started noticing the man who ordered small black coffee at exactly 3:07 a.m. every single night, and nothing made sense anymore. He first appeared on a Tuesday in September, walking through the door at precisely 3:07 a.m. Eve glanced up from wiping down the espresso machine and immediately registered something off about him, though she couldn't identify what. He was maybe 40 years old, average height, wearing a brown jacket and slacks that looked vaguely dated but not overtly costume-like. He approached the counter, made eye contact, and said in a flat voice, "Small black coffee, please." Eve prepared it, charged him $2.75, and watched him count out exact change from his pocket, all quarters, 11 quarters. He took his coffee to the corner table by the window, the one furthest from the counter, and sat down with a newspaper. Eve went back to her closing tasks, thinking nothing of it until she glanced over and noticed the newspaper was yellowed with age. And when she squinted at the date visible on the masthead, it read April 1983. The man stayed exactly 16 minutes. At 3:23 a.m., he folded his newspaper, left his empty cup on the table, and walked out the door. Eve found the newspaper when she cleared his table. It was a complete edition from April 17, 1983, in remarkably good condition for a 40-year-old paper, filled with news about events she vaguely remembered from history classes. The next night, 3:07 a.m. precisely, the man walked in wearing the same brown jacket, ordered small black coffee in the same flat voice, paid with 11 quarters, sat at the same table, and read a newspaper dated April 18, 1983. This pattern continued for 2 weeks before Eve decided to break protocol and attempt conversation. When he came in at 3:07 a.m. on a Thursday, Eve prepared his coffee and said, "You're very punctual. Same time every night." The man looked at her with eyes that seemed to focus somewhere beyond her face. "Yes," he said simply. "Work schedule." Eve tried again. "What kind of work do you do?" The man took his coffee, counted out his 11 quarters, and said, "Data processing. Night shift ends at 3. I stop here before going home." His phrasing was odd. Present tense, but referring to circumstances that felt historical. Eve pushed further. "How long have you worked nights?" The man paused, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Confusion, or perhaps recognition that the question was strange. "5 years now," he said. "Started in 1978. Gets easier." Then he took his coffee to the corner table and opened a newspaper dated April 24, 1983. Eve mentioned the regular to Marin, another overnight customer who worked as an emergency room nurse and usually came in around 4 a.m. Marin listened to the description and went pale. "I've been coming here since I was in nursing school in the 90s, Marin said slowly. "There was a guy exactly like that. Same table, same time, same newspaper. I thought he was just eccentric. But that was 30 years ago, and he looked exactly the same then as you're describing now." Eve felt cold. She started researching, using her phone during slow periods to search newspaper archives and obituary databases. She found him. Monroe Hayes, 41 years old, died April 25, 1984, in a car accident at the intersection of 2 streets that formed the route from the coffee shop toward the residential neighborhoods. The accident had occurred at 3:26 a.m. Monroe had worked as a data processor at a company that had closed in 1986. He had been driving home from his night shift, had stopped at a coffee shop, this coffee shop which had been here since 1971 under different ownership, and had been struck by a drunk driver running a red light. Eve studied the dates. Monroe's routine was a loop, April 17 through April 24, 1983, repeating eternally. She was watching him live the week before his death, over and over. Unaware that he would never make it home from the coffee shop on April 25th. The next night when Monroe came in, Eve looked at him with new understanding. She prepared his small black coffee, took his 11 quarters, and said, "Monroe, right?" He looked startled for the first time since she'd been observing him. "Yes," he said carefully. "Have we met?" Eve made a decision. "You're going to think this is strange, but I need to tell you something. When you leave here, be careful driving home, especially at the intersection near the shopping center. There's been accidents there." Monroe's expression shifted through confusion to something like concern. "I'm always careful," he said. "But thank you. I appreciate it." He took his coffee to the corner table. At 3:23 a.m., Monroe folded his newspaper, left his cup, and walked toward the door. Eve called out, "Monroe, seriously, please be careful tonight." He turned, smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him, and said, "I will. See you tomorrow." Then he walked out into the darkness. Eve rushed to the window, watching him walk down the street toward the direction of the intersection where he had died. She lost sight of him after half a block. The next night, 3:07 a.m., Monroe walked through the door, ordered small black coffee, paid with 11 quarters, and sat at his table with a newspaper dated April 17th, 1983. The loop had reset. Eve tried different approaches over the following weeks. She tried to keep Monroe in the coffee shop past 3:23 a.m. by engaging him in conversation. He would glance at a watch that wasn't visible on his wrist and say, "I should get going. Work tomorrow." She tried to directly tell him he was going to die. He looked at her with profound confusion and said, "I'm not sick. I feel fine." She tried to follow him one night, grabbing her coat and running after him. But he vanished at the exact spot where the intersection would be. Simply disappeared, as though he'd walked through a doorway into somewhere else. The loop was inviolable. Monroe was living his last routine, the final week before everything ended, completely unaware that he was trapped in April 1983 while the world moved on without him. Eve talked to other late-night regulars about Monroe. Capri, a grad student who studied physics, theorized about temporal loops and consciousness. Emilia, a security guard with an interest in the paranormal, suggested Monroe was a residual haunting, a recording playing on repeat. Jessica worked at the same hospital as Marin and remembered hearing about Monroe from older nurses. He'd become a local legend, the ghost who orders coffee. Hallie, who owned a bookstore and came in at 2 a.m. to write, said she'd documented Monroe in her journal in 2008 and had compared notes with another writer who documented him in 1995. Monroe had been ordering the same coffee at the same time for at least 30 years, possibly longer, trapped in a loop that might extend back to the day after his death in 1984. The coffee shop is still open 24 hours. Eve still works the graveyard shift. Monroe still arrives at 3:07 a.m., orders small black coffee, pays with quarters that somehow remain valid currency despite being from 1983, sits at the corner table, reads newspapers from April of that year, and leaves at 3:23 a.m. to drive toward an intersection where he died 41 years ago. Eve serves him every night. She's stopped trying to warn him, stopped trying to break the loop, stopped attempting to save someone who is already long past saving. Instead, she makes sure his coffee is fresh. She greets him by name, and she treats him with the same courtesy she extends to every customer who walks through the door seeking something warm in the dark hours, because maybe that's all any of us are. Collections of routine and habit, repeated patterns that define our days, loops we walk through whether we're aware of them or not. Monroe's loop is just more visible than most, more tragic in its brevity, more honest in its repetition. Eve watches him walk out every night at 3:23 a.m., heading toward the intersection where he'll die again, or perhaps where he died once and continues dying in a moment stretched across decades. She wipes down his table, throws away the newspaper from April 1983, and prepares for the next customer. Because someone has to witness Monroe's final routine. Someone has to remember that he stopped for coffee on his way home, that he was careful and punctual and polite, that he existed in those 16 minutes between arriving and leaving. And if bearing witness is the only thing Eve can offer to a man who's been walking toward his death every night for 41 years, then she'll be there at 3:07 a.m., coffee ready, greeting him by name, honoring the routine that has become his eternity. Alejandra had been patrolling the tech campus for 11 years, and she knew every building's schedule. At 39, she understood the routines of software engineers who worked late, the patterns of cleaning crews, the locations of every security camera and badge reader across the sprawling corporate complex. She carried a tablet that displayed real-time access logs, showing her exactly who was in which building at any given moment. The overnight shift was typically quiet. Most employees went home by 8 p.m., leaving only the occasional deadline-driven programmer working past midnight. Building C had been demolished in 2022 to make way for a larger structure scheduled for completion in 2027. The site was currently just grass and construction markers, an empty field where a 6-story office building had once stood. So when Alejandra's tablet showed a badge swipe for Building C at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, she assumed it was a database error. When she looked toward the empty field and saw lights on what should have been the 3rd floor, she knew something had broken in reality. The badge access log showed the employee's name clearly: Gabrielle Mitchell, software engineer, Department of Cloud Infrastructure, badge number 4738, status, deceased 2021. Alejandra had been working here when Gabrielle died. It had been sudden, an aneurysm at her desk during a late-night coding session. Gabrielle had been found the next morning by the first arrivals, slumped over her keyboard, a half-empty coffee cup beside her. Code still displayed on her monitors. The death had shaken the campus, prompted discussions about work-life balance and the culture of extended hours, resulted in mandatory wellness training that everyone had sat through and then promptly forgotten. Building C had been her primary workspace. She had practically lived on the 3rd floor, often working 16-hour days, deeply invested in a critical infrastructure project that had been behind schedule. The project had been canceled after her death, deemed too complex to continue without her specific expertise. Alejandra walked toward the location where Building C had stood, her flashlight cutting through the October darkness. The grass was wet with dew, recently mowed, completely undisturbed. But when she looked up at where the 3rd floor would have been if the building still existed, she saw light. Not bright, just the ambient glow of office lighting, and a silhouette of someone sitting at a desk. Alejandra raised her tablet and switched to the security camera view for that sector. The camera feed showed only grass. She looked up again with her own eyes. The silhouette was still there. Clearer now, a woman with her hair pulled back, hunched over a keyboard, the posture of someone deep in concentration. Alejandra walked to the exact spot where Building C's entrance had been. The temperature dropped noticeably, a cold pocket in the mild autumn air. She heard typing, the rapid clicking of mechanical keyboard keys, the sound carrying from nowhere, from empty space where nothing should be producing sound. She checked the badge access logs again, scrolling through recent activity. Gabrielle's badge had registered entries on 17 nights over the past 3 months, always between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., always Building C, always showing her as currently in the building, even though the building was rubble and memory. Alejandra dug deeper into the archived logs, going back to 2022, 2023, 2024. The pattern extended years. Gabrielle's badge had been swiping in regularly since her death, though the frequency had increased recently. The building demolition in 2022 hadn't stopped the access logs. The badge system continued registering her presence in a structure that no longer existed in any physical sense. Alejandra spent her lunch break in the campus archives, reading about Gabrielle's project. It had been ambitious, a complete overhaul of the company's cloud infrastructure, billions of dollars in potential savings. Years of work compressed into an impossible timeline. Gabrielle had been brilliant, obsessive, singular in her focus. The project documentation showed her working alone most nights, refusing to delegate, convinced that she was the only one who understood the full architecture. The code repository showed her last commit at 11:41 p.m. on the night she died. A comment reading, "Almost there." just need to debug the failover sequence. The failover sequence had never been completed. The project had died with her, all that work abandoned, thousands of hours of coding reduced to archived files that no one would ever review. The next night, Alejandra brought a portable camera with a small screen, the kind security used for inspecting hard-to-reach areas. She positioned herself at the edge of where Building C had been and turned on the camera, pointing it at the empty air where the third floor should exist. Through the camera's screen, she saw it. The building rendered in perfect detail. Walls and windows and interior lighting all visible through the lens, even though looking directly showed only grass and night sky. She adjusted the zoom, focusing on the third floor window where she'd seen the silhouette. Through the camera, Gabrielle was clearly visible, sitting at her desk, surrounded by multiple monitors displaying code, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. The office looked exactly as it had before demolition. Same layout, same furniture, same corporate artwork on the walls. Gabrielle looked exactly as Alejandra remembered her from 11 years of brief interactions. Mid-30s, dark hair, intense expression, completely absorbed in her work. Alejandra watched through the camera for 20 minutes. Gabrielle never looked up, never paused, never showed any awareness of the world outside her coding. At 12:17 a.m., Gabrielle suddenly stopped typing and put her hand to her head, a gesture of pain or confusion. She stood up unsteadily, reached for her phone, then collapsed back into her chair. Through the camera, Alejandra saw Gabrielle slump forward, saw the exact moment of death replaying in the building that no longer existed. At 12:19 a.m., the lights in the Phantom building went dark. The camera showed only empty field. Alejandra lowered the device, her hands shaking. She had just watched Gabrielle die again, or perhaps watched a recording of her death that played nightly in space, that remembered what had happened there even after the physical structure had been erased. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Gabrielle's badge swiped in at 11:47 p.m. She worked at her desk, visible only through cameras or occasionally to Alejandra's peripheral vision when the light was right. She collapsed at 12:17 a.m. The Phantom building went dark at 12:19 a.m. The next night, the cycle repeated. Alejandra researched the specific night of Gabrielle's death. She had been working on the failover sequence, the final critical component of her project. The code had been almost complete. Another few hours and she might have finished. But her body had failed first. Stress and exhaustion and genetic predisposition combining to cause catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. She had died 90 minutes into her night shift, with her project 90% complete, trapped forever in those 90 minutes of work she'd never get to finish. Alejandra began documenting everything. She took photos through the camera showing Building C rendered visible. She recorded the typing sounds. She compiled the badge access logs. She wrote detailed reports that she kept in personal files because she knew no one would believe them. But documentation wasn't enough. Gabrielle was trapped in her final work session, endlessly trying to complete code that would never be finished, dying repeatedly in a building that had been demolished, existing in a space between physical reality and corporate memory. Alejandra thought about the nature of that trap. Gabrielle had defined herself by her work, had given everything to the project, had literally died at her desk trying to finish it. And now she was completing that dedication eternally, working the same 90 minutes forever, approaching completion but never reaching it, dying before the code could be deployed. One night, Alejandra made a decision. She accessed Gabrielle's archived code repository using administrative credentials, found the incomplete failover sequence. and spent 3 weeks teaching herself enough programming to understand what Gabrielle had been trying to do. Then she brought in Yara, a senior engineer who had worked with Gabrielle and remembered the project, explaining that she needed help completing abandoned code for archival purposes. Yara agreed, curious about the old project. And together, they finished the failover sequence, writing the final functions that Gabrielle had been working toward. They documented everything properly, attributed it correctly to Gabrielle's original architecture, and uploaded it to the repository with a commit message. Completion of Gabrielle Mitchell's infrastructure project, finished posthumously in her honor. The code would never be deployed. The company had moved on to different systems. But it existed now, complete, fulfilling the purpose Gabrielle had died pursuing. The next night, Alejandra watched through her camera as Gabrielle worked at her desk in the Phantom building. At midnight, instead of collapsing, Gabrielle stopped typing, leaned back in her chair and smiled. A small, satisfied expression of accomplishment. She stood up slowly, gathered her things, and walked toward the elevator that no longer existed. Alejandra tracked her movement through the camera. Gabrielle entered the elevator, the doors closed, and when they opened on the ground floor, she stepped out into empty space and faded away completely. The badge system registered her swiping out at 12:03 a.m. It never registered her presence again. Building C's new structure is scheduled for completion in 2027. Alejandra still works campus security, still patrols the site where the old building stood. The grass has been replaced with foundation work now, concrete and rebar rising toward the future building's shape. Sometimes late at night, Alejandra thinks about Gabrielle working in the space that remembered her, trapped by unfinished business that defined her existence. The badge access logs show no more phantom entries. The typing sounds have stopped, but Alejandra keeps the camera footage saved on a private drive, evidence that someone cared enough about their work to continue it after death. And that sometimes the only way to free someone from their obsession is to help them finish what they started. The new Building C will house different teams, different projects, different people working late into the night. And maybe some of them will feel a presence occasionally, a sense of someone who worked here before, who loved the work enough to never leave, who only found peace when the code was finally complete. Beatrice had been working the parking garage for 7 years, and she knew every vehicle that belonged there. At 45, she had memorized the patterns of overnight parkers, the nurses who worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital 2 blocks away, the attorneys who left their cars while traveling for business, the residents of the luxury apartments who paid monthly fees for guaranteed spots. The garage had 8 levels, 463 spaces, and a computerized system that tracked every entry and exit with timestamp precision. Beatrice's shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 8 hours of monitoring cameras, collecting payments, and patrolling the concrete levels in her electric cart. She appreciated the solitude, the predictability, the way she could walk every level and know exactly which cars should be there and which were anomalies. Level 4, Spot 237, had been empty for years, ever since the incident in 2018. So when a silver sedan appeared there at 2:15 a.m. on a Thursday in October, Beatrice knew immediately that something was deeply wrong. The car was a Honda Accord, maybe 10 years old. Silver paint that caught the fluorescent lights in a way that made it look almost luminous. Beatrice hadn't seen it enter through the gate. The computerized entry log showed no new arrivals since 11:47 p.m., and she'd been at her booth the entire time. The car simply existed where it hadn't existed during her 1 a.m. patrol. She walked to level 4, her footsteps echoing in the empty garage, and approached spot 237. The sedan was parked perfectly within the lines, engine off, no driver visible inside. Beatrice checked for a parking ticket on the dashboard. There was none. She wrote out a citation for parking without payment and placed it under the windshield wiper, noting the license plate number to enter in her violation log. The plate read YBK 7743. She returned to her booth and ran the number through the state vehicle registration database. The car was registered to Della Hartman, age 36, address in the residential neighborhood north of downtown. Vehicle status: destroyed 2019, total loss, crushed at salvage yard. Beatrice stared at her computer screen, reading the status notation 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. The car in spot 237 had been destroyed 3 years ago, officially removed from registration, yet it was currently parked on level 4. She walked back upstairs with her phone, taking photographs of the vehicle from multiple angles, the license plate clearly visible, the condition of the car showing no damage, the empty interior with a coffee cup in the holder and a phone charging cable plugged into the dashboard. When she returned to her booth and reviewed the photos, they showed the car exactly as she'd seen it. This wasn't a hallucination or a trick of lighting. The Honda Accord was physically present in a space where it shouldn't be able to exist. The next night, 2:15 a.m. precisely, Beatrice checked the garage cameras remotely from her booth. Level 4, spot 237, showed an empty space at 2:14 a.m. At 2:15 a.m., the silver Honda simply appeared, transitioning from non-existence to presence between one frame and the next. No car drove in, no headlights swept across the concrete, no sound of an engine. The vehicle materialized as though it had always been there, and Beatrice had simply failed to notice it until that exact moment. She grabbed her cart keys and drove up to level 4 immediately, arriving at spot 237 within 90 seconds of the car's appearance. The Honda was there, engine running this time, exhaust visible in the cold October air. Beatrice approached cautiously and looked through the driver's side window. A woman sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, staring straight ahead with an expression of profound confusion. The woman was in her mid-30s, wearing business casual clothing, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. Beatrice recognized her from the registration photo, Della Hartman. Beatrice knocked on the window gently. The woman turned her head slowly, looking at Beatrice as though seeing her from a great distance. Beatrice gestured for her to roll down the window. Della did, the window lowering with an electric whir that sounded too loud in the quiet garage. "Are you okay?" Beatrice asked. Della's voice came out hoarse and uncertain. "I can't find the exit. I've been driving around, but every turn just brings me back here." Beatrice felt cold spreading through her chest. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Della looked at the dashboard clock, which read 2:17 a.m. "I came in around 2, she said. "Stopped to make a phone call before going home, but now I can't find the way out." Beatrice took a breath. "What's today's date?" she asked carefully. Della frowned. "October 18th. Why?" Beatrice's throat tightened. "What year?" Della's confusion deepened. 2018? What kind of question is that? Beatrice stepped back from the car. "Try driving out," she said gently. "Follow the exit signs. I'll watch." Della nodded, put the car in gear, and began driving slowly toward the down ramp that led to level 3. Beatrice followed in her cart, maintaining distance, watching as Della followed the clearly marked exit route. The Honda descended to level 3, turned toward the level 2 ramp, followed the arrows painted on the concrete. But as Della made the turn onto level 2, something happened. The space seemed to fold, reality seemed to skip. And suddenly the Honda was back at level 4, spot 237, engine running. Della gripping the wheel with increasing desperation. Beatrice watched it happen 3 more times. Della following the exit route, the car somehow looping back to the same spot, geography refusing to allow departure. After the 4th attempt, Della parked the Honda in spot 237, put her head on the steering wheel, and Beatrice saw her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Beatrice parked her cart and walked to the driver's window. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "and it's going to be hard to hear." Della looked up, tears on her face. "What year do you think it is?" Beatrice asked again. "It's 2018, Della insisted. Beatrice shook her head. "It's 2025. You've been here for 7 years. Della stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. I just drove in. I was on my way home from work. I stopped to call my sister, tell her I'd be late for dinner. That was 20 minutes ago." Beatrice pulled out her phone, showed Della the date on the screen. Della's face went pale. "I don't understand," she whispered. Beatrice spent the next hour researching on her phone while Della sat in her car, processing impossible information. The archives of the local newspaper yielded the story. October 18th, 2018. Woman found dead in parking garage, level 4, spot 237, carbon monoxide poisoning, car engine running overnight. Ruled accidental death. Della Hartman, 36, software developer, had stopped at the garage to make a phone call before going home. She'd left the engine running for heat. The garage's ventilation system had been under maintenance that week, not operating at full capacity. Carbon monoxide had accumulated in the enclosed space. Della had fallen asleep or lost consciousness while talking on the phone. She'd been found the next morning by the early shift attendant, dead in her car, phone still in her hand, engine still running. The car had been towed, eventually crushed, officially destroyed. But something of Della had remained, or returned, trapped in the moment of her last conscious decision, to stay in the car, to make a call, to delay going home by just a few minutes. Beatrice tried to explain it to Della, showing her the newspaper article, the death record, the evidence that 7 years had passed. Della rejected it initially, insisted this was a prank or a mistake. Tried calling her sister on her phone that no longer connected to any network. Eventually, as the dashboard clock ticked past 3 a.m., Della's resistance crumbled into acceptance. "I'm dead," she said flatly, "and I'm stuck here." Beatrice nodded. "You keep trying to leave, but you can't. Every night at 2:15 a.m., you appear in this spot, you try to find the exit, and you end up back here." Della looked around the garage, at the concrete and fluorescent lights and painted lines that had become her entire universe. "How do I get out?" she asked desperately. Beatrice didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "But you're not alone. I see you. I'm here." Over the following months, Beatrice adjusted her routine to include spot 237. At 2:15 a.m., she would go to level 4 and wait for Della to appear. Sometimes Della would try to drive out, and Beatrice would follow, watching the impossible loop repeat. Sometimes Della would just park and sit, and Beatrice would sit with her in the passenger seat. 2 women in a dead car in a parking garage at 3 a.m., talking about nothing and everything. Beatrice learned about Della's life, the job she'd loved, the sister she'd been close to, the plans she'd had for her future that had ended in this concrete space. Della learned about the world that had continued without her. 7 years of changes, technologies she'd never use, events she'd never witness. The conversations were strange and sad and somehow necessary. Companionship offered across the boundary between life and death. Beatrice researched hauntings, spoke to Cameron, who claimed to understand paranormal phenomena, consulted with Katie, who practiced some kind of spiritual healing. No one had answers about how to free someone from a geographic loop, how to release a consciousness trapped in the moment of its death. Della appeared every night without fail, 2:15 a.m. in spot 237, trying to leave and failing, returning to the place where she died. Beatrice was there every night, bearing witness, offering presents, making sure Della didn't spend eternity alone in a parking garage that had become her prison. Some nights, Della talked about her frustration, the crushing weight of repetition, the desire to move forward that was physically impossible. Other nights, she talked about acceptance, about finding peace in the routine, about appreciating Beatrice's companionship as the only constant in her endless present tense. The garage still operates 24 hours. Beatrice still works the overnight shift. At 2:15 a.m., a silver Honda Accord still appears in level 4, spot 237. And a woman who died 7 years ago still tries to find an exit that no spatial logic will allow her to reach. Beatrice still goes up to level 4, still sits with Della when the attempts to leave have failed, still provides the only human connection available to someone trapped between presence and absence, between arrival and departure, between the decision to stay just a few more minutes and the eternal consequence of that choice. The other parking attendants notice that Beatrice spends unusual amounts of time on level 4, that she talks about spot 237 as though it requires special attention, that she refuses to allow that space to be reassigned or remarked or changed in any way. They think she's superstitious or eccentric. They don't know that she's maintaining vigil for Della Hartman, who just wanted to make a phone call before going home, and instead found herself trapped in a parking garage for 7 years and counting, forever trying to complete a journey that ended the moment she decided to wait just a little bit longer. Florence had been cleaning the high-rise office building for 23 years, and she knew every floor in intimate detail. At 52, she'd spent thousands of nights pushing her cleaning cart down the empty hallways, disinfecting surfaces, changing trash liners, and listening to the lonely hum of air conditioning after the last employee had gone home. Her shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., a stretch of quiet hours spent alone with her thoughts and the endless rhythms of custodial work. The building directory listed 47 floors, but Florence had always known that something about the building's architecture felt off, as though the space itself hid secrets even the blueprints refused to reveal. The elevator panel was familiar territory, each button pressed 100,000 times over the years. But last month she noticed an anomaly. A 48th button, darker and slightly raised, wedged between 47 and roof access, and labeled with no number, just a faint scuff mark. Florence pressed the mystery button on impulse during a slow Wednesday night. The elevator hummed, doors closed, and the car began to rise past 47, past the floors she'd cleaned 1,000,000 times before. It came to a stop with barely a whisper. The doors slid open, and Florence stepped out onto a floor that shouldn't exist. The air was thick with the scent of old carpeting and aging electronics. The decor was frozen in time. Wood paneling, avocado green walls, rotary phones perched on desks, typewriters and manual ledgers scattered about. Every last detail was perfectly maintained, as though the office had been in use that afternoon. She could hear the soft ring of telephones, the low hum of conversation, keyboards clacking with the urgency of another era. Yet there was no one visible. No cleaners, no night guards, no overtime staff catching up on work before the end of the month. She wandered the floor in awe, picking up papers dated October 23, 1974. The coffee cups on desks still steamed faintly, and the clocks all read 11:56 p.m., their second hands frozen mid-tick. As she moved past the vestibule, Florence found a metal plaque reading Management Services, Level 48. She'd never heard of any such designation in the building's layout or archival logs. A cold chill settled over her shoulders. The overhead lights flickered, and Florence found herself drawn toward a conference room where the air felt heavier, as if the space itself was dense with memory. The newspaper at the head of the table, aged with time, bore a headline, Financial District Fire Kills 12. Her breath seized in her chest. She recognized the news event from old stories she'd heard from other custodians and maintenance men over the years. A catastrophic electrical fire that had consumed the top floor of the building, killing 12 executives in a blaze that turned the city's business community upside down. The official records had always said the fire happened on the unfinished 47th floor. Florence now understood that the true story had been suppressed, sealed behind renovation and bureaucracy. The floor had been erased from maps and directories, but the building remembered. On her third visit, Florence arrived just before midnight and lingered by the elevators. As the clock passed into the witching hour, the elevator pinged and the doors opened. 12 people in bell-bottom suits, pencil skirts, and oversized glasses stepped out, brushing past her wordlessly. Their faces were sharp with worry, their movements purposeful, their eyes fixed on paperwork and schedules she couldn't see. Florence watched them walk through the office, their voices a low, anxious murmur as the hour grew later. She stood, frozen, as the hum of typing and conversation rose to a fever pitch. At 11:58 p.m., a faint smell of smoke drifted in. One by one, Florence noticed the employees turning to stare at nothing. Faces locked in a rictus of terror as the room temperature soared. Their screens and ledgers blurred, fire alarms wailed, and in the chaos, the 12 vanished. The business attire, the lingering sense of urgency, the electrical hum, they faded, replaced by absolute silence and the oppressive stench of burned plastic. Florence stood in the aftermath, alone. Each time she visited the 48th floor, the pattern repeated. The arrival of the executives, the fevered activity, the smell of smoke, the moment of death. It was a loop, replaying the final minutes before the fire. A tragedy relived nightly in a space that refused to be forgotten. She researched the city's archives, locating sealed court filings and payout agreements with families silenced by legal threats. The building had suffered heavy damage, the renovation erasing all traces of that top floor except in the haunted architecture, where a misplaced button granted access to history. The blueprints now showed 47 floors, but Florence knew the truth. In the dark hours, the building asserted its memory. The tragedy returned like a repeating wound. She learned the names of the 12 who had died: Dorothy, Xiomara, Elisa, Rain, Florence, Alicia, Madeleine, Melanie, Catalina, Zariah, Bonnie, and McKenna. She whispered their names as she cleaned, leaving fresh cloths on their desks as a gesture of respect, a way of saying, "I see you, I remember." Some nights, the button would vanish. Other nights, it would return, and Florence would ride the elevator once more, arriving to quiet conversations, the urgent typewriters, the faint static of radios reporting the weather. The horror was not just the fire, but the knowledge that death could become routine, replayed endlessly, pushed out of sight but never truly gone. Florence couldn't change the fate of the 12. She couldn't fix the fire, couldn't pull them from the flames, couldn't rewrite a history that the architects and executives had gone to great lengths to erase. But she could bear witness. She could watch the process, recognize the tragedy, offer a kind word or a silent prayer. Her custodial work became ritual, cleaning what others forgot, caring for spaces erased by official decree, honoring the memory that the city tried so hard to suppress. The building would always have 48 floors, even if only at midnight, even if only for her. No one else believed the stories when Florence shared them. Not Mavis on the day crew, not Louise at the front desk, not Katie, Cameron, Araya, or Arlette, who rotated shifts with her every few months. They laughed, dismissed it, said she worked too much, dreamed too little, needed to retire before age caught up. But Florence knew reality wasn't so easily defined by maps or manuals. Spaces remember. Floors forget nothing. Time bends in the places people die, and tragedy etches itself into the architecture, replaying when night and memory are quiet enough to let the truth through. And so, each night, Florence pushed her cart, pressed the unmarked button, and ascended to the hidden floor, prepared to witness the end again, prepared to honor the lives lost to fire and corporate secrecy, prepared to clean what no one else would. Because bearing witness was what mattered. Because remembrance outlasts everything. Because the building needed her as much as the memory needed telling, and she would keep riding the elevator until someone else remembered too. Patricia had worked as the night watchman at the Regional History Museum for nearly a decade, and she had seen the building in every conceivable state of darkness and silence. At 38, she respected the power of the exhibits and the hush of the galleries, understanding that objects could carry the memory of disaster just as surely as they carried dust. Her shift began as the janitors finished up and the last curator switched off office lights, and she settled into her rounds, moving from marine history to local artifacts with practiced efficiency. The museum was at its most alive in the hours after midnight, as Patricia walked the corridors listening for anything out of place. She learned which displays creaked and which paintings seemed to move in the corner of the eye. But nothing unnerved her quite like the model ship in Gallery 3, a glass case containing a perfect replica of the SS Pacific. Every night, Patricia would pass by the SS Pacific and note its position inside the case. Sometimes it faced east, sometimes west, sometimes angled as if it rode an imagined current. She thought she was losing track at first, dismissing it as a trick of memory, until she started snapping photos with her phone to confirm. The ship moved. Not dramatically, no sudden jumps, just a few centimeters progress along the fake waves painted on the case floor. Checking museum archives, Patricia read that the real SS Pacific had vanished in a November storm off the Pacific coast in 1875. Hundreds dead, bodies never found, local legend claiming the ship still appeared as ghost lights on the sea in certain fogs. Patricia realized the model was retracing the doomed vessel's route in miniature, crossing from bow to stern over the course of a month and returning to its original position every few weeks. Caught in an imaginary journey that the dead never completed. Patricia paid closer attention in the small hours, especially after 3 a.m. when the museum could feel more like an echo chamber for tragedy than a showcase of history. One night, as she stood by the SS Pacific, she noticed something impossible. Movement on the deck. Tiny figures, detailed beyond what any modeler would have bothered with, milling about as if preparing for a rough passage. She wiped fog from her glasses, certain she was imagining things, until she watched a miniature crewman tie off a line, then another ring a tiny bell. The water in the case, just blue resin, seemed to ripple. The ship's hull rocked as though hit by wind. Patricia felt a chill and stepped back, unsure whether to call a supervisor or try and film what she was seeing. At 3:47 a.m., Patricia returned and saw the ship listing in a heavy storm. Tiny hands struggled with ropes, little painted faces looked fearful, and the foamy resin at the bow seemed wild with impossible motion. She heard, faint but unmistakable, the echo of storm sounds. Howling wind, frantic shouts, the splinter of wood. The ship began to founder, rocking violently, objects pitching overboard. Patricia's rational mind fought with her senses. This was a museum display, a static model. But it was sinking. Over 20 minutes, the drama played out in surreal detail. The miniature SS Pacific vanishing beneath the resin waves until there was nothing left but debris and ghostly silence. By 4:07, the ship was reset at its starting position. The deck clear, the crew prepared for another voyage. Patricia checked her phone against museum records. The sinking of the real SS Pacific had happened at exactly 3:47 a.m., November 4th, 1875. She was shaken, but every night she returned to the case, watching the ghost journey repeat. She mapped its position, charting the progress, noting the actions of figures who seemed to grow more animated every week. She began to catch familiar faces in the crowd. Elisa, Rain, Florence, Alicia, Madeleine, Melanie, Catalina, Zariah, Bonnie, and McKenna, names she recognized from archived ship manifests, victims of the original disaster. She whispered their names under her breath as she walked past the model each night. She noticed other patterns. The fog inside the glass thickening at certain times, the faint outlines of water stains appearing and disappearing, the museum's lightning system flickering exactly at the moments the SS Pacific entered troubled waters. Patricia confided in a fellow guard, Imani, who dismissed her reports as sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations. Mallory from the admin office laughed and suggested calling in paranormal investigators for a publicity stunt. Patricia stubbornly continued her private rituals. On the anniversary of the disaster, she left a single flower beside the case, and at precisely 3:47 a.m., watched as a tiny painted figure turned and seemed to nod directly at her. Afterward, the outline of the ship on the glass grew brighter, like a message of acknowledgement that her presence was felt. She wondered what it meant for the dead to be remembered by someone watching every night, to be grieved or honored in a place designed for historical memory. Patricia's nights became defined by her interactions with the SS Pacific model. She checked it at every opportunity, marking its progress, listening for changes in the room's silence. Some nights, the storm would be mild, and the sinking would be quick, almost merciful. Other nights, the ship struggled long against invisible waves, the despair of its crew lingering for an hour. Patricia felt, in these moments, the vivid ache of what was lost at sea, the hope that someone might someday witness and comprehend the full scale of the tragedy. She started documenting her experiences, hiding her notes behind the display, leaving little tokens of comfort, a scrap of ribbon, a polished stone, anything that suggested someone on shore cared enough to mark the passing. She came to understand that the horror was not in the haunting itself, but in the story the haunting told. Lives repeatedly lost to disaster. Memories confined within the boundaries of a display case, voices calling soundlessly for acknowledgement. The museum was designed for education, but for Patricia, it had become a place of vigil, of devotion to those caught in time. The SS Pacific traveled each night, mapped by invisible forces across a looping circuit, reliving a never-ending storm. Watched only by a night guard who had come to consider the ship and its lost crew as the central figures in a drama of infinite empathy. Patricia never discovered the source of the ship's curse. No explanation in moldy paperwork or archived stories. She simply accepted that some histories replay eternally, that bearing witness is sometimes the only gift possible. She told Chloe from Visitor Services that the dead must be seen to be remembered. and Chloe nodded and said she'd heard similar stories from other night guards on other shifts. When a new curator, Raylan, tried to renovate Gallery 3, Patricia argued fiercely for the case to remain untouched. For her, the small ship represented a complex, endless negotiation with loss and recognition. A tragedy acknowledged each night. A resolution that never came, but remained meaningful for the effort alone. The museum's tagline was, "Preserving the past for the future." And for Patricia, it was literal. Each dark hour, she watched history repeat. The SS Pacific crossing an impossible void, crew and passengers enduring again what the living could choose simply to forget. Some nights she wept quietly, not for fear or confusion, but for kinship. The dead were not alone, because in the silent halls, beneath the glass, the replayed disaster found a witness, and the night watchman ensured that the memory never faded, even when the world beyond had let it go. Helena worked as the night projectionist at the city's old theater, the kind that smelled perpetually of velvet and dust, its corners thick with the secrets of 100 forgotten performances. At 40, Helena was partial to solitude and comfortable in the company of ghosts. Ghosts in the theatrical sense. The memories of applause soft as rain in an empty hall. Stray playbills from decades past drifting beneath the seats, actors' makeup tables still ringed with ancient powder. For most of her life, Helena found herself drawn to places others called obsolete. Yet the peculiar chill in the balcony, the way sound seemed to warp on certain stairs, never unsettled her. Only lately had the theater itself made her wonder if living memory was all that haunted those ornate halls. The theater earned its reputation for oddness, honestly. The marbled lobby was lined with portraits of actresses in black and white, each with a tragic story. Ushers told each other about the Blue Lady, a woman who appeared in the mezzanine, icy cold to the touch. Stagehands shared tales of laughter in the dark, props rearranged during silent nights, mysterious lipstick stains on the bathroom mirrors. Avalon, a senior technician, claimed the central chandelier flickered Morse code on performance anniversaries. But he was a romantic, given to invention. Helena dismissed these stories until interrupted routines began multiplying. Film reels inexplicably threaded backward, projection lights flicking on in empty booths, shadows darting through the orchestra at 3 a.m. One Monday night, Helena was prepping midnight screenings. She paced the projection booth, checking bulbs and focus, when she heard the distant echo of applause, a subtle, persistent clapping that swelled, receded, then burst forth again. There were no shows scheduled for that hour. All seats were empty below. When the house lights flickered blue, Helena descended and crossed the velvet aisles. The applause followed, swelling from balcony to orchestra to stage, as if the crowd itself wandered the theater in search of something unfinished. The clapping ended at the orchestra pit, abruptly replaced by the faint melody of an old waltz. Helena stood alone at center stage, chilled to her bones. Helena's peculiar encounters gathered form over subsequent months. One night, she found rows of seats lowered as if patrons had settled in while she was gone, programs fanned across armrests where she'd left none. On another, the house mic registered the breathy static of rehearsal whispers when the only living person in the theater was herself. Once, after rehearsing lines for a forgotten play, she returned to the booth to see stage curtains trembling, applause blooming beneath the glass, and a faint blue mist drifting up the Juliet staircase. It was after these nights that the dreams began. She dreamed of standing in the wings with other projectionists, all waiting for their cues, though the plays never started and the audience never arrived. Each time, she woke to the taste of cold air and the thrum of distant music. The core of the haunting proved to be the projection booth, a glass enclosure hovering above the audience like a birdcage. Helena noticed a pattern. Each time she passed a particular reel storage cabinet, the room's temperature dropped. Silent to the point of pressure, and the faint voice of a woman whispering her lines slid through the glass. One evening, while cleaning a misthreaded reel, Helena glanced at the wall clock and saw Helena written in glowing script. Her own name, not etched or drawn, but floating within the glass for just a moment. Startled, she called her colleague Reina, who brushed it off as digital fatigue or afterimage from the work lights overhead. Yet Helena knew when memory and shadow parted ways. This was something else. Helena started compiling notes on the strange occurrences. She logged instances of music playing from unpowered speakers, doors creaking open to the backstage corridors, and recurring digital glitches on the ticket scanner, names from decades-old cast lists popping up on modern receipts. The most annotated record, though, was the nightly visitation of the Blue Lady, seen by ushers, custodians, and late-working actors. According to legend, she was a chorus girl from the 1920s, said to have fallen from the lighting grid during a rehearsal. Others cited her as a vanished leading lady who died on opening night, condemned to wander, searching for her curtain call. Ushers described her presence as sadness tinged with rage. Musicians reported an Arctic draft on the back of their necks when she was near. Helena had her own encounter late in autumn. She was inspecting the lower ballroom, long abandoned, when a spectral waltz floated beneath the doors. Across the mirrors at the far wall, fog collected, resolving slowly into a blue silhouette with feathered hair and flowing sleeves. The Blue Lady drifted forward, stopped before Helena, and held out a single white rose. "Did I do well?" the apparition breathed. Helena, terrified and oddly tender, whispered that she was wonderful. The Blue Lady smiled, dissolved, and the room's temperature rose by several degrees, as if someone had finally permitted rest. From then on, Helena felt watched, but in a companionable way. The projection system ran smooth. The tapes, once prone to tangling, threaded themselves without complaint. She took extra care lighting the booth, greeting both audience and spectral company as she went about her duties. Every month, on the anniversary of an infamous fire that had damaged the upper wings a century prior, Helena found red lipstick traces reappearing on the women's restroom mirrors. She cleaned them as she always did, leaving behind a scrap of pink ribbon as a peace offering. Following the usher's old superstitions that such gifts placated restless spirits, when theater management hosted its first overnight ghost tour, a desperate ploy to fund repairs, Helena was tapped to supervise. She watched silently as guests tried to summon the Blue Lady, pried for EVP recordings, scanned the stage for energy orbs. All Helena recorded was the usual click and pop of electrical lines settling, the hum of history thick and patient, waiting for actors that never stepped into the light. She spoke with an elderly woman who revealed she'd been a chorus member in 1952. The old performer insisted the Blue Lady was not a restless soul, but a protector. Her applause the belated reward for those who stayed too long or sang too earnestly to be completely forgotten. Helena resolved to restore the neglected fragments of the theater's past. She tracked down lost costume jewelry in the props attic, slipped old playbills between the pages of the library's log. For those working after midnight, McKenna in the box office, Faye in engineering, Louise sweeping the stairs, Helena became so much a fixture herself. She was soon the subject of stories. Helena, the quiet projectionist, witness to midnight applause, keeper of the watching Blue Lady. Sometimes children passing on daytime tours pointed to the balcony, and claimed to see a woman in blue waving to them, mouthing their names in silent encouragement. The theater was older than anyone living could remember and would outlast even Helena's devotion. But the truth of the place unfolded each night. Applause given to an empty stage, music that returned in the bones, soft footprints on marble, lipstick stains that vanished at dawn. Helena came to cherish what grew in the dark, the stories held aloft by velvet seats and stubborn light. The audiences fell away, the staff rotated with time. But Helena always arrived for her lonely shift, greeted the ghosts, threaded the film, and cued the invisible curtain. Perhaps, she thought, every theater was a tomb and a cradle. Performance and rest, memory and yearning. Perhaps the Blue Lady wandered not for herself, but for those still breathing. So every performance, even if doomed to fade, could echo past the lonely hours until someone answered back. Jessica spent most of her 35 years in libraries. 8 of those years as the night cataloger in the city's University Research Library, a place that wore silence like a shroud and transformed at midnight into something both more honest and unsettling. Behind the ornate doors and miles of stacks, the library harbored secrets older than the campus itself. Jessica loved the hushed atmosphere and the weight of knowledge, the whispered hints of the past, the creaks of ancient wood. Most nights, she logged books, sorted rare collections, and found herself lost in reverie among titles most students would never read. But sometimes she wondered if the quiet was too deep, if the stillness hid more than forgotten manuscripts. The rare books section was Jessica's favorite, a sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and yellowed paper. Only a handful of staff members had keys to the secure room, which held everything from first editions to indecipherable journals written in extinct languages. Strange things happened there. Lights flickered, rarities went missing and reappeared, doors stuck inexplicably. Other catalogers whispered stories about Cameron, a librarian who vanished decades ago. A myth so routine Jessica assumed it was campus legend. Yet the room itself seemed to breathe. The air colder at 2 a.m., the walls vibrating with the tension of being observed. Every Thursday, at exactly 3:15 a.m., a single book appeared in the overnight drop box. Each time, it was Maritime Disasters of the Pacific Northwest, 1850-1950. A battered volume checked out in 2003 and never returned. Jessica always found it alone, waiting for her, stamped with a due date years in the future, sometimes 2027, sometimes even farther, beyond the expected lifespan of the library system itself. The book's margins were filled with notes, research questions, observations, desperate pleas dated from 2003 up to 2025, with entries from 2026 and beyond. The handwriting changed, sometimes hurried, sometimes elegant, sometimes shaky, as if written under duress or in pain. Jessica realized the newest notes mentioned things that hadn't happened yet. Shipwrecks unresolved, news stories unreported, personal events she knew would only occur if certain conditions were met. She shivered, wondering if the book had become a portal, a locus where time lost its regular shape. The library's checkout card named the original borrower, Liana Brennan, a graduate student in history who'd vanished without trace in October 2003. Jessica dug through the archive and found the case file. A missing persons report, a campus search that went nowhere, a few rumors, and dead-end sightings. But what revealed the true horror were the annotations. Can't find the right date. Stuck in stacks. If anyone reads this, I'm still here. It was clear Liana was drifting between times, somehow unstuck, her consciousness writing desperate messages for future catalogers. Each Thursday, Jessica watched her signature mutate across decades, scrawled between the lines like coded distress signals. Determined to understand, Jessica stayed late one Thursday, sitting among the rare books as the clock crept toward 3 a.m. She heard footsteps echoing between the shelves, too heavy and patterned to belong to mere rats or midnight HVAC cycles. Jessica's heart pounded as a cold draft swept the room. A woman appeared from a shadow in the stacks, dressed in the faded cardigan and jeans popular on campus in the early 2000s. Liana moved like someone half-present, phasing in and out near the bookshelves. Jessica called her name, and Liana responded, her gaze sharp, her voice trembling with confusion. "Are you real tonight?" she whispered. Jessica nodded. Liana clutched the disaster volume to her chest. "I've tried to get out, but every exit is the wrong year." She showed Jessica the margins, desperate maps, altered timetables, anxiety about lost memories. "Sometimes I find my way, only to fall back. I try to write what I learn, hoping someone will piece it together." The library hummed louder. Jessica felt the world slip sideways. Her phone's clock jittered, the lights in the stacks flickered, the familiar hum changed frequency. The air buzzed with history, dozens of lost voices pressed close. Jessica asked how long Liana believed she'd been lost. Liana shrugged. "Minutes, maybe years." Time distorted for those caught between realities. In libraries, in books, maybe everywhere, memory pressed a person too close to knowledge. "You have to remember me," Liana said, "so I can find a way back." Jessica promised. At 3:28 a.m., Liana handed her the book and began to fade, each detail dissolving slowly into the chill. By 3:30, only the volume and fresh notes remained. Jessica dove into research, uncovering stories of haunted libraries, librarians who died at their posts, students who disappeared into special collections, ghostly figures who helped patrons and vanished. The lore of haunted libraries was rich with people like Harriet, the first librarian at Hoyt Library, and Erastus from Peoria Public Library. Their spirits haunting stacks, typing at invisible keyboards, wandering night corridors with spectral resolve. Strange lights, orbs, cold splashes, mysterious chalkboard messages, all reported over decades by staff and patrons who sensed something persistent behind the walls and rows of books. Jessica realized her library wasn't unique. Libraries everywhere were loci for temporal strangeness, a web of people distanced from life and stretched between pages, dates, and catalog records. The following Thursdays, Jessica watched the Dropbox. Each time the disaster book appeared, new entries appeared in the margins. "You kept your promise," Liana wrote, "and I moved closer to finding the right exit." Sometimes the handwriting was clear and strong, other times barely legible, perhaps written during a flurry of time regression or panic. Jessica began counter-writing in the white space. "Liana, you are here now. We see you." She hoped her act of memory would anchor Liana in the stable present. Jessica involved other catalogers, Yara, Brianna, Faye, Cameron, even Mavis, quietly at first, then openly as they noticed the recurring book. Each contributed a line of support, a small note, a welcome. Their combined effort formed a communal anchor, a web of recognition strong enough to bridge the gulf between times. Liana's messages became less frantic, her notes clearer, her sense of hope growing as she realized she was remembered across the years. Yet the library itself resisted closure. Some nights, the disaster book vanished, only to reappear weeks later with a new set of marginalia. Rumors abounded, voices in the basement, arguments from nowhere, children's laughter at 4 a.m. The technology glitched, scanners showing Liana's student ID, security cameras panning to empty zones, checkout computers freezing on her image. Visiting students caught glimpses of her in the north stacks, always vanishing as they approached. Older faculty claimed to have seen her during the years right after she disappeared. Jessica wrote up the story for the library log, omitting supernatural details but preserving the facts. A book that returns weekly. Messages that offer proof of a time slip. A missing graduate student whose fate remains unconfirmed but is woven into the fabric of the institution. As an unofficial memorial, she placed a placard in Rare Books. In memory of Liana Brennan, History. If you see her, say hello. The acknowledgement seemed to steady the library's subtle thrill of energy. Lights flickered less, the air felt warmer, and the disaster book's notes grew almost content by spring. With Liana's latest message reading, "Found my place for now. Thank you." The lore of haunted libraries is never simple. The buildings are too old, the stories too convoluted, the layers of knowledge too thick. Jessica marked most nights, not by fear, but by ritual. Checking the drop box, reading Liana's new messages, passing the placard, and whispering every name she knew who had watched and remembered. Sometimes she felt time blur in her own thoughts. Felt the possibility of dropping between decades, knowing every exit could lead to the wrong year for someone too entangled with the silence. But Jessica never forgot that her role in the strange matrix of history and possibility was to witness and document, to give the lost a tether, to help a fellow cataloger find her way home, even if home meant a shelf, a margin, or a line in a haunted library's records. In libraries, especially at night, the boundaries between past and present shift. Jessica understood this now better than anyone. When she locked up after her shift and exited into the nearly silent city, she felt the weight of all the stories just below the surface. Stories asking to be found, names needing to be spoken, and time waiting for someone to remember. She left the lights on a little longer, just in case, so no one drifting through decades in search of their way out would have to do so in the dark, unseen, or alone. Stephanie had never truly feared hospitals. At 32, she was accustomed to the fluorescent harshness and antiseptic tang, the low murmur from the nurse's station, and the predictable parade of gurneys, alarms, and hushed conversations marking the endless transit between life and death. She knew grief intimately, lived among the unspoken stories of patients and staff. On her shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, Stephanie moved with purpose. Hands steady as she checked heart rates, cleaned wounds, untangled IV tubing. The overnight quiet felt both sacred and exposed, a time when reality softened and the odd, impossible and profoundly human, all pressed close to the skin. There was a story old as the hospital itself. The Gray Lady of Room 19. Stephanie first heard it from Louisa, a veteran nurse whose silver hair seemed an emblem of institutional memory. Louisa swore the Gray Lady appeared each year on the anniversary of a child's death, gliding down the ICU corridor, searching for her lost son. Stephanie smiled gently. Legend was woven deep in these walls. Still, she noticed that on the November anniversary, infants in the cot nearest room 19 always woke screaming, as if recalling some ancient terror. Nurses moved the cot, but the crying followed, finally resulting in the cot's destruction as a last act of defiance. It didn't stop the sightings, though. Stephanie herself had glimpsed something pale in the periphery, unmistakable dread coloring the hum of monitors and distant feet. Not all hauntings announced themselves so plainly. In pediatrics, Stephanie was assigned Room 12, notoriously avoided by staff who spoke of locked doors opening on their own and odd, cold drafts swirling through the bedspreads. Previous nurses whispered about the boy in white, a child who had died in the 30s and, according to nonverbal patients, still wandered the halls in faded overalls and a lopsided smile. Stephanie snorted when she heard it. Nurses were not by nature superstitious. Yet she couldn't ignore the blind Alzheimer's resident who described the same child in detail, or the dying woman who, after years of silence, looked past Stephanie toward the shadows and murmured, "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. I love you." True to her words, she died exactly 24 hours later. Stephanie spent the next week avoiding mirrors, unsure whether what she'd witnessed was natural or supernatural, or both tangled together as they so often are. It was the porter who haunted Stephanie most. The story, older than even Louisa's tenure, described a hospital porter who had taken his own life in a small room off one of the main landings. He bled out before help could arrive, and now, as legend told, lingered in the corridor as a privileged visitor. Nurses reported seeing him standing, pale and still, outside Ward D, visible through a glass door. If spoken to, he melted away. Stephanie learned of his muted presence on rounds, her companion Brianna guiding her carefully and suggesting not to address the apparition for fear of scaring probationary nurses. Yet his form was seen so often, reassuring somehow, a reminder of sadness enduring but unthreatening. One early morning in her 3rd month, Stephanie was called to room 8. The patient, Jimena, was in palliative care, near the end but restless, convinced she was not alone. "He wants something," Jimena hissed, eyes bright and terrified. "He won't leave me." Stephanie checked the monitors, all normal, but felt the hairs on her neck rise as the temperature dropped. She whispered reassurances both for patient and herself. "You're safe. I'm with you." As Stephanie gently closed Jimena's eyes after her passing, she looked over her shoulder just in time to see the porter fade through a wall. She zipped the body bag slowly, praying that those who remained found peace in the gaps the living left behind. There were nights when technology sharpened the horror. Security cameras captured movement down empty corridors. Pharmacy carts moved between stations with no living push. And multiple staff recorded unexplained voices, snatches of song or low, mournful humming. One engineer, Edith, documented cupboard doors opening in unison in unoccupied rooms just moments after a patient died. That was enough, Edith said, to keep her from ever working alone on the overnight maintenance rounds. Stephanie believed her. Hospitals collect tragedy like dust, and the machinery sometimes reflects back what the heart struggles to accept. The most chilling event happened at the end of Stephanie's 4th year, when she encountered the Laughing Man. Assigned to monitor vital signs in geriatrics, Stephanie found herself repeatedly summoned by an agitated patient, Zara, terrified of dying. Whenever her monitor beeped, Zara screamed, "Don't let me die!" Stephanie calmed her, held her hand, and promised relief. Then the alarms blared. The cardiac monitor flatlined. Stephanie raced in only to see Zara floating 2 inches above the bed, laughing with dry, unearthly mirth. Stephanie, paralyzed by the impossible, watched as Zara's eyes locked onto hers. When the body finally settled, the monitor silenced and Zara's voice hissed from all corners of the room. "You let her die. Too bad." For weeks afterward, Stephanie and the others suffered nightmares, haunted by the feeling that some deaths, no matter the effort, refused closure. Stephanie's colleagues, Armani, Kyla, May, Jimena, Brianna, Edith, Zara, Louisa, formed a community around these events, sharing stories as lifelines. Some brought talismans, religious artifacts, or just handled the strangeness with humor. They lit candles in break rooms, whispered prayers in the utility closet, and left notes for each other in the ward log, evidence that the living are not entirely alone, and the dead not entirely forgotten. Hospitals, Stephanie learned, are as much about remembering as healing. The rooms retain history pressed deep into their walls, repeat traumas in cyclical patterns, and often teach lessons only interpretable through myth. Stephanie found comfort in bearing witness. If a death was witnessed, the soul was seen. She made a habit of learning and honoring the names of each patient and staff member who lingered. Willa, Helen, Emily, Alessandra, Gracelyn, Carolina, Arlith, Salem, Dorothy, Xiomara, Elisa, Rain, Florence, Alicia, Madeline, Melanie, Catalina, Zariah, Bonnie, McKenna, Imani, Armani, Edith, Nalani, May, Vienna, Hadassah, Stephanie, Ari, Kate, Yemena, Brianna, Faye, Jordan, Louise, Amber, Michaela, Zahra, Lila, Margot, Amura, Jennifer, Kyla, Mila, Winnie, Allison, Amalia, Rena, Aviana, Ali, Ivana, Aria, Lillian, Alia, Ilani, Noah, Raina, Lexi, Brinley, a litany for the living and the lost. In the end, the stories Stephanie carried were not about fear, but about connection. Each haunting reminded her that the span between light and shadow was small, the divide between routine and anomaly flexible and permeable. To survive in such spaces, she clung to compassion and memory, telling ghost stories as acts of retrieval, attempts to make sense of the impossible. When the blue dawn finally washed the halls and the early shift arrived, Stephanie gathered her belongings with gratitude and sorrow. The ghosts, she understood, were not here to threaten, but to be named, recognized, remembered. They were companions for the journey between rooms, witnesses for the work that matters most, seeing the unseen, loving the unloved, and refusing to forget. Stephanie's hospital would see many more years, many more ghosts. She walked out, heart full, bearing her list like a shield and a prayer. Hospitals may pull the lost and the found close in dark hours, but the true haunt is the kindness those left behind summon to each new day. Samuel had operated construction cranes for over 2 decades, and the Skyline Tower project was supposed to be just another job in his lengthy career. At 48, Samuel had mastered the art of solitude, working hundreds of nights 300 feet above the city, moving steel beams and concrete blocks with precision, his only company the hum of the city below and the blinking lights affixed to his crane. The construction site was bustling in the day, but eerily silent at night, every movement carefully coordinated with engineers and ground crews by radio. What unsettled Samuel most was not the height or the danger. It was the visions he could not explain. The building was planned as a 60-story marvel of modern architecture, evolving slowly skyward with every concrete pour and steel weld. But Samuel had started noticing discrepancies. Floors appeared complete through his crane's zoom camera, finishes, lighting, even furnishings that were physically impossible given the pace of construction. At first, Samuel thought he was tired or his camera malfunctioning. The crane's controls had diagnostic errors too often lately, glitching with software that hadn't been fully tested. Then, one night, the 23rd floor had a fully furnished office space, visible only through the crane's camera, but not with his naked eye. He watched a man sitting at a desk, head in his hands, staring at a glowing monitor. Each night these illusions grew more vivid. Samuel saw residents moving on floors that didn't exist yet. Workers typing on computers, conversations in leather chairs, meetings held in conference rooms still months from completion. One night, Samuel squinted closer and focused on a man in a sharp suit, Armani, who seemed deeply troubled, restlessly pacing the floor. Armani glanced through the large windows as if seeking escape from a prison not of walls, but of time itself. Samuel's blood ran cold as he saw Armani open a window. There was no actual glass or frame there yet, just a void of night and air. And step out, disappearing with a final look of anguish. Haunted by his visions, Samuel began documenting everything. He logged the times and noted when these future floors appeared, always between 1 and 4 a.m., and cataloged descriptions of the figures he saw. The dates on calendars in the offices often read years ahead, 2028 or 2029, well beyond the building's scheduled completion in 2027. He spoke in hushed tones to Liana and Hadassah, fellow night workers who handled site management and logistics, convincing them to look through the crane camera. They too saw the impossible. Rooms fully furnished, lights glowing warmly in steel skeletons, people busy living lives before the physical structure existed. Weeks passed, and the visions intensified. Armani's plight troubled Samuel most deeply. Late one night, he witnessed Armani walk toward the edge of the future 47th floor window and step into the void. Time seemed to ripple as he fell, the absence around him swallowing his footsteps. Samuel realized he was witnessing a suicide years before it happened, a future tragedy unfolding as if trapped in an endless cycle of despair. Horrified, Samuel tried to intervene. He consulted with Cameron, an engineer and close friend, who suggested the building might be experiencing a quantum anomaly, a convergence of past, present, and future layered spatially. Cameron theorized temporal echoes might be anchored to the building's architecture, a storehouse of memories yet to occur, projecting them backwards into the present. Samuel refused to accept the tragedy was inevitable. One night, he left a note on the future Armani's desk. "You are not alone. Someone sees you and cares." The note was a fragile lifeline, but Samuel hoped it could break the cycle. He returned each midnight, watching the projection, waiting for signs of change. Armani continued to pace, glanced toward the window, and the despair remained. But sometimes a flicker of hesitation passed through him. Samuel whispered encouragement to the empty sky, reminding him that no future was fixed, that hope could exist between the beams and girders of tomorrow. As the construction neared the 40th floor, the blurred boundary between time and space sharpened, and the building bit deeper into its secret. Samuel sensed that the future was watching him back, that his presence mattered as much as the echoes he observed. He continued his nightly vigil, a witness and possibly a guardian to a future not yet written. The Skyline Tower would open in 2027, becoming a landmark, a symbol of progress and urban renewal. But Samuel knew there were stories beneath its gleaming facade, stories of pain, loss, and fragile hope caught between the beams of unfinished floors. He worked in the silence, between welding sparks and radio chatter, carrying the weight of those unseen lives, of Armani and the others who might still find their way to another path. For Samuel, the crane was no longer just a machine, it was a bridge, between years, between selves, between the grief of what might be, and the courage to face what could yet become. And every night, he climbed the ladder to the crane cab, stepped into the glow of his screens, pressed the levers, and watched the improbable cityscape of futures unfold before him, a witness to time's unfinished business.